For 10 years, the oak tree stood tall in the corner of my yard, a living monument of time and tranquility. It wasn't just a tree. It was a witness. It had seen storms bend its branches, seen neighbors come and go, and still stood strong through every season like a sentinel guarding the land. Its roots ran deep into the soil, into memory, into everything that made my house feel like home. Every morning, I'd sit on the back porch with my coffee and watch the sunlight pour through its branches. The golden rays would filter through the leaves, painting shifting patterns across the grass. Birds sang from its limbs, and squirrels raced up and down its trunk like it was their playground. During summer, that oak gave life to the yard. Its shadow kept the ground cool and soft, its leaves whispered secrets in the wind. When I first bought the house, that oak was one of the reasons I said yes. It made the property feel alive. A connection to something older and wiser than any of us. But in the house next door lived the kind of person who couldn't stand not being in control. Her name was Patricia, though everyone whispered another name behind her back, Karen. And she fit it perfectly. Karen believed the world should align with her preferences. The neighborhood was her kingdom, and the HOA was her throne. Every week, she'd find something new to complain about. Trash cans not pulled in fast enough, lawn edges not sharp enough, cars parked half an inch too far onto the street. But soon, her complaints began to orbit around one thing. My oak tree. At first, it was subtle, passive-aggressive remarks during HOA meetings. She'd mention how some trees blocked sunlight from reaching certain gardens. Then came the friendly notes on my mailbox suggesting I trim it down for everyone's sake. But that tree wasn't bothering anyone, except her. The truth was simple. She hated that it stood taller than her house, that its shade stretched over part of her flower beds, that nature dared to exist outside her control. Over time, her frustration turned to obsession. I'd catch her peeking over the fence, taking photos with her phone. Once, I saw her with a measuring tape, pacing along her yard line, muttering to herself. I ignored it. You learn to ignore people like that, until they go too far. And she went too far. It was a Saturday morning. The kind where the air smells clean, the sun is soft, and you think nothing could ruin your day. I walked outside, coffee in hand, ready to enjoy the quiet. But what I saw made my heart stop. The oak was gone. Not trimmed. Not damaged. Gone. All that remained was a raw, torn stump, sawdust still fresh on the grass, roots half exposed, like a wound ripped open overnight. The ground looked naked, violated. The air felt wrong, heavy, still, too bright. For a moment, I just stood there. The world went quiet. Then it hit me like a punch to the chest. Someone had cut it down. And I didn't need to ask who. Through the fence, I saw her. Karen. Standing in her yard with a smug smile, watering her plants as if nothing had happened. As if she hadn't just erased a piece of living history. I later found out she'd hired a landscaping crew the previous afternoon. Told them it was her tree leaning over her property. Said it was a hazard. Said she had permission. She lied through her teeth, waved around fake paperwork, and by the time anyone could question it, my tree was already gone. When I confronted the HOA, they shrugged. Said it was a property dispute. The city clerk said it would take weeks to investigate. The police told me it was a civil matter. Everyone looked away. Everyone wanted to stay out of it. So I stood there, staring at the empty patch of dirt where the oak once stood, and I made a decision. If justice wouldn't come from the system, it would come from me. At first, it wasn't anger, it was grief. Real, heavy grief. The kind that seeps into your bones. Every morning, I'd wake up and glance out the window, half expecting to see those branches swaying in the wind. But there was only sky. Bare, cruel, endless sky. Karen, meanwhile, was thriving in her victory. She started bragging to neighbors. Told them her new sunlight made her flowers bloom faster. Talked about how her backyard finally felt open. She even laughed one afternoon as she told the mailman, he'll thank me one day when he realizes how much better it looks. I didn't thank her. I watched. I listened. I planned. Because revenge, real revenge, isn't loud. It's patient. It's quiet. It doesn't rush, it calculates. I started by visiting the city's zoning office. Quietly. No calls, no letters, no warnings. I studied property lines, setback rules, and privacy ordinances. And that's when I found something interesting. Karen's house sat just far enough from the boundary that a structure built on my side could legally reach 16 feet tall without violating code. 16 feet, tall enough to block sunlight from her entire backyard. That was the moment the seed of revenge took root. I contacted a contractor. Not a big company, a small, discreet one that didn't ask questions. I told them I wanted a privacy wall, a sound barrier made of concrete and stone. Something strong, I said. Something permanent. As the paperwork was filed, Karen kept boasting about her flowers, her open view, her new light. Every word she spoke only fueled my resolve. She thought she'd won. She thought cutting down that oak meant she'd erased me from her little world of perfection. But she hadn't just removed a tree. She'd woken something else, something far older and deeper than her petty control. By the time the permits cleared, my plan was ready. I stood at the edge of the stump one last time, tracing the rings with my hand. Each ring was a year, a memory, a moment that tree had survived, storms, winters, heat waves. It had endured everything. Until her. But it would return. Not as bark and leaves, but as stone and shadow. If she hated shade so much, I'd give her shade forever. And this time, she couldn't cut it down. Because revenge, like an oak, grows slowly. But when it takes root, nothing can stop it. When you lose something you love, there's a strange silence that follows. It isn't just the absence of sound, it's the absence of presence. My backyard, once full of whispering leaves and dancing shadows, now felt hollow. Every gust of wind reminded me of what was gone. The grass was brighter, but it felt dead. Too much sun, too much exposure. It was like living under a spotlight I hadn't asked for. But for Karen next door, the world had never looked brighter. I'd catch glimpses of her standing proudly in her yard, hands on hips, soaking in the sun that now fell freely across her deck. She'd invite friends over for tea, pointing proudly at her newly opened backyard. She even installed a new patio umbrella, as if to gloat, shade of her own making, under her control. I stayed quiet. I smiled when we crossed paths. She thought I'd moved on. But silence can be mistaken for peace, when in truth, it's the sound of something far more deliberate, patience. Behind that silence, the blueprint of revenge had begun to take shape. It started with a single folder: permits, boundary maps, elevation drawings. I visited the zoning office every week, learning more than any homeowner should ever need to know about privacy laws and property rights. I memorized setback distances, construction limits, height restrictions. Karen had her sunlight because she believed she'd taken control. She thought she'd erased my shade forever. But she hadn't realized the law gave me something much more powerful: permission. I found the loophole. My property line allowed for a privacy wall up to 16 feet tall as long as it was constructed for security or sound mitigation. The language was vague, flexible, perfect. I worked with an architect who understood discretion. We designed a wall that wasn't just a fence, it was a statement. Reinforced concrete with a textured stone facade, rising like a fortress from the soil. It would run along the entire length of the property line, right where the oak once stood. When the blueprints were complete, I looked at them for a long time. Straight lines. Cold. Unforgiving. Exactly what I needed. Construction began quietly. The first few days were just surveying and marking. Orange flags and chalk lines tracing the boundary. Karen noticed, of course, she always noticed. From her patio, she'd watch with narrowed eyes, pretending to water her plants while eavesdropping on every conversation. Eventually, she couldn't help herself. She called out, her voice sweet and sharp like lemon on a wound. "Big project?" she asked one morning. I simply nodded. "Just improving the property." She smiled that fake, tight-lipped smile. "Oh, I'm sure it'll look lovely." Then she walked back inside, her expression twisting the moment she thought I couldn't see. The following week, trucks began to arrive. Gravel, cement, rebar. The sounds of engines and clanking metal replaced the quiet hum of birds. For the first time since the oak fell, the air around my yard felt alive again. Karen's perfect mornings were shattered. From dawn till dusk, hammers pounded, drills whined, and saws sliced through wooden stone. She'd stand by her window glaring, clutching her coffee cup like it might explode in her hand. I could almost feel her frustration growing with each passing day. At first, she tried politeness. She approached the workers, asking about noise regulations. Then she sent emails to the HOA, claiming I was disturbing the peace. But every complaint bounced back the same way, within property rights. Because this time, I was untouchable. She couldn't stop what she'd started. As the wall began to rise, its shadow crept slowly across her lawn. At first, it was small, just a faint line stretching over her flower beds. But with every new layer of stone, it grew longer, darker, colder. By the third week, The sun that once flooded her patio was gone by noon. By the 5th week, her backyard, once her pride and joy, was cast in permanent shade. Neighbors began to whisper. They'd walk past the construction and shake their heads. Some laughed quietly, knowing exactly what was happening. Others pretended not to notice. But everyone felt it, the shift, the balance of power tilting. Karen's backyard, once a place of sunlight and tea parties, now looked like the base of a canyon. The wall towered above her fence line, smooth and silent, reflecting none of the light she'd stolen. And I'll admit, it felt good. Not loud, vengeful good. Not the kind that burns hot and fades fast. This was a cold satisfaction, like watching justice carve itself into stone. She tried to fight back, of course. She filed a complaint with the city, claiming I was building without permission. But I was ready for that. Every permit was stamped, every signature legitimate. When the inspector came by, I greeted him with coffee and a copy of every document neatly in order. He walked the site, nodded approvingly, and left. Karen watched from behind her blinds as the city official drove away, her last hope gone with him. After that, she grew quiet. The woman who once shouted about lawn heights and garbage bins barely spoke at all. Her flowers began to wilt without direct sun. Her grass turned patchy, dull, lifeless. The same light she'd stolen now belonged to me. One afternoon, I stood by the wall, running my hand along the rough surface. It felt solid, permanent. The oak's absence no longer a wound, but a foundation. And that's when it hit me, she hadn't just taken a tree. She'd created a wall she'd have to live beneath forever. The irony was beautiful. The woman who loved sunlight now lived in shade. The woman who bragged about opening her space now stared at 16 feet of stone every time she looked outside. The wall didn't just block her view, it consumed it. At sunset, when the light hit the top edge of the wall, it cast a long, perfect shadow across her entire backyard. Like a reminder. Like a scar. Sometimes, I'd catch her standing there, staring up at it, motionless. Maybe she was realizing what she'd done. Maybe she was trying to convince herself she'd won. But deep down I knew, she understood. Revenge had taken root. But I wasn't finished. Because the wall was only the beginning. She had built her comfort on taking something from me. Something living, breathing, irreplaceable. So I decided to take something from her in return. Not her house. Not her garden. Something deeper. Something slower. Peace. Because the thing about living in the shade is that eventually you start to feel the cold. And once you feel it, it never really leaves. The wall stood complete, a monument to consequence, a boundary carved from silence and stone. For weeks, I watched how it changed the rhythm of the neighborhood. People slowed their walks as they passed it. Some whispered. Some smirked. Others pretended not to see. But everyone felt it, the quiet authority it carried. And then, there was Karen. In the beginning, she tried to ignore it. She'd pretend nothing had changed, still stepping out into her yard with her morning cup of tea. But she couldn't escape the truth. The sun that used to bathe her patio in light now slipped away by noon. The vibrant garden she'd bragged about began to dull, her roses bending toward the fence like they were searching for warmth. It didn't take long before frustration set in. Every morning, she'd stare at the wall jaw tight, eyes tracing its smooth, towering face as if she could find a flaw, a weakness. But there were none. It was perfect. Too perfect. Within days, the neighborhood gossip started to spread. People talked, not loudly, not to her face, but in hushed tones over fences and at mailboxes. How she'd gone too far cutting down someone else's tree. How karma had finally found her. Some even said the wall looked beautiful. Like it belonged there. That was the part that stung her the most. Because the wall didn't just block her sun, it became a symbol of her defeat. She tried to fight back, of course. It's what people like her do when they lose control. Her first move was predictable. She called the HOA. She claimed the wall violated neighborhood aesthetic harmony. She said it was an eyesore, a community nuisance. But the HOA board, the same one that had once ignored my complaints about her tree stunt, now seemed to have a change of heart. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe they just didn't want to get involved again. Either way, they told her what she didn't want to hear. The wall was legal. The permits were valid. And I was well within my rights. That was the first crack in her kingdom. The second came from her own doing. Karen began sending letters, long, dramatic messages to every neighbor in the cul-de-sac. She wrote about how unfair I'd been, how heartless it was to ruin the character of the neighborhood. But her words fell flat. Because everyone remembered. They remembered her threats, her complaints, her arrogance. The way she'd marched across lawns and told people how to trim their hedges. She wasn't the victim she wanted to be. She was the storm that had finally been silenced. And when the sympathy she expected never came, something inside her began to break. I noticed it in small ways at first. The way she lingered by her window longer than usual. The weeds spreading in her garden, left unpooled. The sound of her lawn mower growing quieter each week. Her yard, once the pride of the block, was beginning to crumble, just like her composure. But then, the quiet war turned darker. One morning, I stepped outside to find small chips along the bottom of the wall. At first, I thought it was just wear from the construction. But as I got closer, I noticed the marks, uneven, rough, fresh. Someone had tried to damage it. It didn't take much to guess who. For a few nights, I stayed awake later than usual, sitting by the window, lights off. And sure enough, around midnight, I saw her. A small figure in a robe, creeping into the yard, flashlight in hand. She thought no one was watching as she swung a metal rod against the wall, desperate to leave a mark, any mark. Each swing echoed through the night, hollow and pitiful. The wall didn't budge. It just stood there, silent and unmoved, while her anger bounced back at her in echoes. Eventually, she gave up, throwing the rod into her grass before stumbling back inside. That was the night I realized, this wasn't just about sunlight anymore. This was about power, control, ego. And she was losing all three. The next week, the HOA received another anonymous complaint, this time, about nighttime noise disturbances. The complaint described suspicious activity, coming from her property. I never claimed to know who sent it. But soon after, an HOA representative stopped by her house for a wellness check. The whole neighborhood saw. Curtains shifted. Heads turned. The woman who once ruled the block now stood at her own doorstep, explaining herself to the same system she'd weaponized against everyone else. The cracks were spreading faster now. Her plants began to die completely, starved of light and care. The once bright patio furniture faded under the growing shadow of the wall. The laughter of her weekend guests vanished. Even the wind seemed quieter on her side. I started noticing her car leaving the driveway less often. Her mailbox overflowed with uncollected letters. Days went by without her stepping outside at all. Then came the rumors. Someone said she'd been trying to get a real estate agent to help her sell. Others said no one wanted to buy the shaded house. Property value was dropping, because of the wall. Irony has a way of circling back. Months passed, and the seasons turned. The trees around the block began to lose their leaves, but my wall stood strong, gray, steady, untouched. It cast its shadow faithfully every day, stretching longer with the autumn sun. And in that shadow, Karen's world quietly fell apart. Her yard became a forgotten corner of the neighborhood, silent, colorless, empty. She stopped waving to anyone. She stopped speaking altogether. And though I never saw it directly, sometimes at night, I'd catch faint glimmers of light through her window, the kind of glow that comes from a single lamp in a dark room. The kind of light people sit under when they can't sleep. The kind of light that whispers regret. It would have been easy to feel pity. But revenge isn't about cruelty, not when it's justified. It's about balance. And now, the balance had been restored. Still, I couldn't help but wonder, how far would she fall before she stopped trying to climb back? Because there are people who can live in their mistakes. And there are people who get swallowed by them. Karen was the second kind. And soon, the neighborhood would see that too. Because when winter came, and the sun hung low in the sky, her backyard fell into full darkness. Not a single ray reached her windows after mid-morning. It was poetic, really. The woman who had once demanded sunlight now lived in a permanent dusk. And though she didn't know it yet, her story, and mine, wasn't finished. Because the cracks in her kingdom were only the beginning. The real collapse was still coming. By winter's edge, the neighborhood had changed. The laughter, the lawnmowers, the hum of weekend life, it all seemed quieter. Maybe it was the cold air. Maybe it was the shadow that stretched from my side of the fence to hers. Karen's house stood like a forgotten monument, still gray and strangely lifeless. The yard that once bloomed with color now lay dull under the pale light of winter. Dead leaves clung to the fence like faded memories. The once proud rose bushes had withered, skeletal and brittle in the frost. And behind those windows, she stayed hidden. Weeks passed without anyone seeing her. The mail piled higher in her box. Flyers and newspapers gathered like a record of neglect. People whispered about her at the community center, about how the Sun Queen had vanished into her own shadow. But I knew she hadn't disappeared. I saw the flickers of light late at night. The faint movements behind her blinds. The restless pacing of someone who couldn't find peace. Revenge had done its job, but it had also stirred something darker inside her. Because some people, when faced with consequences, reflect. Others implode. The first real sign came one morning when I stepped outside to find a line of footprints in the snow, small, neat, leading from her yard to mine. They stopped at the base of the wall, right where the oak tree once stood. I followed the trail with my eyes, half expecting to find something missing. Instead, I found a message. Carved crudely into the concrete near the bottom edge were 3 words scratched with what looked like a key. "You'll regret it." The letters were uneven, trembling, full of rage. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. Not out of fear, but out of realization. This wasn't over. She wasn't letting go. Later that week, the HOA sent out an email to all residents reminding them about property vandalism and neighborly conduct. It didn't name names, but everyone knew who it was about. Still, she stayed quiet, at least during the day. Then, one night, everything changed. It was late, almost midnight, when I woke to a low rumble. At first, I thought it was thunder. But the sky was clear. Then came a sharper sound, metal against stone. I looked out my window, and my chest tightened. There she was again. Wrapped in a heavy coat, flashlight strapped to her wrist, swinging a hammer at the wall like a woman possessed. Each blow echoed through the night air, wild and desperate. She didn't care who heard. She wanted to break something, anything, to prove she still had power. But the wall didn't yield. The hammer bounced, sparks flew, and her frustration boiled over. She screamed, an inhuman sound swallowed by the cold wind. Then she picked up a shovel and slammed it against the stone until her arms shook. I watched from the darkness, motionless. It wasn't satisfaction I felt this time. It was something heavier, pity maybe. The wall had won, but the victory didn't feel clean anymore. Eventually, she collapsed onto the frozen ground, breathing hard, the shovel clattering beside her. The flashlight rolled away, its beam cutting across the snow like a spotlight. When I checked the damage in the morning, there was almost nothing. Just another small chip in the base, a few scratches, but the message was clear. Karen had reached her breaking point. The next few days were chaos. Neighbors talked. Someone had filmed her that night, grainy footage from a security camera showing her swinging the hammer at the wall. It spread through the HOA group chat like wildfire. People laughed. Some pitied her. Others were furious. The HOA called an emergency meeting. For once, she didn't show up to speak. No long speeches, no complaints, no lectures about property standards. She just disappeared again. But the damage to her reputation was permanent. The woman who had once bragged about order and control was now the talk of the neighborhood, a warning of what happens when pride turns poisonous. A week later, a city inspector showed up. Someone, maybe the HOA, maybe a neighbor, had filed an official report about property damage and mental instability. They wanted a welfare check. The inspector knocked, waited, knocked again. No answer. When she finally opened the door, I saw her from a distance. She looked smaller, thinner, paler. The woman who once strutted across lawns now stood hunched, wrapped in a sweater, eyes hollow. She spoke briefly, nodded, and closed the door again. After that, she didn't come outside for a long time. Spring came slowly that year. The snow melted, the air softened, and the grass began to return. Birds nested in the few remaining trees. Life moved on, for everyone except her. Her yard stayed gray. No new flowers, no trimmed hedges, no laughter. Just the wall, towering silently, dividing her from everything she once loved. Then, one morning, I saw a for sale sign go up. It was small, leaning slightly to one side, like she hadn't even bothered to secure it properly. But there it was, fluttering weakly in the breeze. The house that had been her kingdom was finally on the market. At first, I thought that was the end, that she'd leave quietly, disappear into some other neighborhood, maybe start over. But the universe rarely lets people like her go without one last show. The final confrontation came a week before the sale closed. I woke to shouting, muffled but sharp, the kind of anger that cuts through walls. A group of neighbors had gathered near her driveway. The real estate agent stood awkwardly by the gate, while Karen screamed about property sabotage and defamation. She accused everyone, the HOA, the neighbors, even the potential buyers, of conspiring against her. Her words came out tangled, half nonsense, half fury. It was like watching a storm finally consume itself. Eventually, the police were called, not to arrest her, but to calm her down. 2 officers stood by her gate, speaking softly until her voice cracked. She stopped shouting, looked around at all the faces staring back, and realized, there was no one left on her side. For the first time, she seemed to see what everyone else saw, a woman who'd lost everything because she couldn't let go of control. A week later, she was gone. The house sold fast, even with the wall. The new owners were a quiet couple who liked privacy. They planted ivy at the base of the stone, letting it climb slowly upward, softening its edges. In time, it almost looked beautiful again. But for me, the wall was more than structure. It was memory. A reminder that peace, once stolen, could be rebuilt, stronger, colder, and lasting. Sometimes I'd stand near it at sunset, watching how the light fell across its surface. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance, about letting time do what it always does. Karen's name still came up in neighborhood stories. But not with fear or annoyance anymore, only with quiet disbelief. She had built her life on control, and when she couldn't control me, she crumbled. Her story became a warning, whispered in new homeowners' ears. Be careful who you cross in this neighborhood. Some roots grow back, stronger than before. And as the seasons turned, the wall stayed, firm, unyielding, eternal. A monument to the tree that once stood there. And to the lesson she left behind. Because the truth about revenge is simple. It doesn't have to be loud. It just has to last longer than the pain. For months after the house sold, peace returned to the neighborhood. The air felt lighter, calmer, as if the walls themselves were exhaling after holding their breath for too long. Lawns were green again, driveways swept, and children played outside without the tension that once lingered between fences. The new neighbors, a quiet couple named the Grants, kept mostly to themselves. They didn't talk much, but they smiled often. They loved the wall, said it made them feel safe, private. They even decorated their side with vines and hanging plants, giving it a touch of life where once there had been bitterness. For the first time in years, my mornings felt normal. Coffee on the porch, the hum of sprinklers, the gentle sound of wind through the leaves of younger trees I'd planted to replace the oak. Life was steady. Simple. Until the rumors began. It started with a passing comment from the mailman, a simple thing, almost forgettable. He mentioned seeing Karen a few streets over, walking quickly, her hood up, avoiding eye contact. Said she was renting a small house near the edge of the neighborhood. I didn't think much of it at first. People move on. They change. They try to rebuild. But something in his tone, that uneasy mix of curiosity and concern, stayed with me. Weeks went by, and the sightings continued. A neighbor said she'd seen her car parked near the cul-de-sac late at night. Another claimed they'd caught a glimpse of her walking along the back road, stopping to stare toward the wall before disappearing again. No one wanted to believe she was still around. The neighborhood had already written her off as a ghost, a story to tell newcomers about why the HOA meetings were quieter now. But ghosts have a way of returning when you least expect them. One night in early summer, I woke to a sound, faint, distant, familiar. The slow crunch of gravel beneath tires. I looked out the window, and under the dim glow of a street lamp, I saw a car idling near the old property. It was her car. I recognized the shape immediately, the same faded silver SUV she used to park like a trophy in her driveway. The headlights turned off. The engine stayed running for a moment, then stopped. Silence. And then, nothing. No one stepped out. No doors opened. Just stillness. After a few minutes, the car rolled away, turning the corner without a sound. For days, I couldn't shake the image. The way it lingered there, headlights dark, watching. The next morning, I checked the security camera near my porch. The timestamp matched exactly. There it was, the SUV pulling up, stopping for 3 minutes, then leaving. No crime, no confrontation. Just presence. But sometimes, presence is enough to unsettle peace. The next week, strange things began to happen around the Grants' property. Their trash cans were knocked over. Garden lights went missing. Small scratches appeared along the side of their fence. They thought it was kids, maybe raccoons. But I knew better. The signs were too deliberate. Too human. It felt like déjà vu. Then, one evening, I saw her. It was just after sunset. The sky burned orange behind the rooftops, and the street was empty except for the faint sound of wind. I was sitting by my window when movement caught my eye, a figure small and thin, standing near the corner of the wall. She wasn't close enough to be clear, but I didn't need details. The stance, the posture, the way her hands fidgeted nervously at her sides. It was her. Karen. She stood there for several seconds, staring up at the wall. Her face tilted slightly, as if she were studying it, remembering it. Then she reached out, pressed a hand against the stone, and stood still. There was something haunting about the gesture, almost gentle, almost mournful. Like someone touching a gravestone. After a minute, she stepped back, glanced toward my house, and disappeared into the dark. That night, I couldn't sleep. The memories came back, the shouting, the vandalism, the endless tension that had ruled my life for so long. But beneath the fear, there was something else. Pity. Because while I'd moved on, she hadn't. She was still living in the shadow of her own choices. The next morning, I found something at the base of the wall, a single dried rose. Old, wilted, its stem wrapped in a scrap of paper. The paper was blank. No message, no name. Just the symbol of something that had once been beautiful, and was now nothing but dust. I didn't tell anyone. Some things are better left unspoken. But word spread anyway. The Grants found similar roses near their garden a week later. Then one morning, they woke to find a pile of stones stacked neatly by the fence, like a small altar. That was when they called the HOA and the police. A patrol car drove through the neighborhood for a few nights, but she was never found. Eventually, the sightings stopped again. The roses stopped appearing. The SUV never returned. Life resumed, though with a faint sense of unease. It wasn't fear exactly, just the lingering knowledge that some ghosts don't fade completely. They just learn to haunt from a distance. Summer turned to autumn again. The vines on the wall grew thicker, winding up toward the top. Birds began nesting in them, the way they once did in my oak tree. It was poetic in a way, life returning where destruction had begun. One afternoon, I noticed a small crack near the base of the wall, not from damage but from age. Weather, erosion, the natural wear of time. I ran my hand along it, feeling the rough texture, the weight of everything it had come to represent. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger or satisfaction. Just peace. Because in the end, revenge wasn't about crushing someone. It was about reclaiming what they took from you, and learning to live again. Karen's story had ended long ago, but its echo would live in every whispered warning, every cautious glance at the wall that still divided light from shadow. The neighborhood had learned something from her, about pride, about patience, about how one act of selfishness can ripple through lives like cracks in stone. As for me, I stopped seeing her ghost. Maybe she left for good this time. Maybe she finally found a place where the sun still reached her windows. Or maybe somewhere, she still stares at a different wall, one built not of stone, but of the choices she made. Either way, I let her go. The wall remained. Steady. Silent. Eternal. And every evening, when the sun began to set and its light kissed the top edge of the wall, I'd see the shadow fall exactly as it had the day I built it. A reminder. A symbol. A monument to balance. And maybe, somewhere beyond the horizon, Karen would see that shadow too, and finally understand what it meant. That some light can only be appreciated once you've lived long enough in the dark. Years passed. The wall stood strong through every season, rain, wind, summer heat. It became more than a barrier, it became a landmark. People used it for directions, turn left at the tall stone wall. Kids rode their bikes past it, tossing glances over their shoulders like it held secrets. For me, life had moved on quietly. The house had changed, a fresh coat of paint, new porch lights, younger trees stretching toward the sky where the oak once stood. The past no longer hung heavy over me, it had settled into memory, distant but never forgotten. Every so often though the light would fall just right in the evening, and the shadow of the wall would stretch long across my yard, almost touching my doorstep. I'd watch it from my chair with a cup of coffee, feeling that same bittersweet ache, the reminder of how everything began. The HOA had changed leadership since then. New people, new policies, fewer battles. The Grants still lived next door, now with a little boy who loved kicking his ball against the side of the wall. The neighborhood was alive again, a place that felt like home. Until one cold morning, a letter arrived. It was nothing special at first glance, plain white envelope, no return address, smudged from the rain. The handwriting though, it stopped me. It was sharp, tilted slightly forward, each letter deliberate. I knew it instantly. Karen's handwriting. The same writing I'd seen scrawled across HOA complaint slips, across warning notices tucked under my door, across the petition she'd once proudly waved at the meeting that nearly turned the whole neighborhood against me. For a long moment, I didn't open it. I just stood there staring. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the strange weight of memory. When I finally tore it open, a single sheet of paper slid out, creased and yellowed. It wasn't long. Just a few paragraphs. No apologies. No excuses. Just words that read like an echo from a life already fading. She wrote that she had moved away after selling the house, but never found peace. Said every street she lived on felt wrong, every neighbor suspicious, every wall closing in. She tried to rebuild, New job, new home, new friends, but the past had followed her like a shadow she couldn't escape. She wrote about the oak tree. Said she never hated it, not really. She hated the feeling of being unseen, unheard, as if life had moved on without her. The tree was just the easiest thing to blame. She wrote about the wall too. Said she drove by often, unable to stop herself. Said she watched the light fade behind it and wondered if it would ever fade from her too. And then, near the end, the letter changed tone. The words grew slower, sadder. She said she was sick. Not with anger anymore, but with time. Something in her body had turned against her, and doctors couldn't fix it. She didn't name it, maybe she couldn't. But she wrote that it had forced her to stop running. I see the wall in my dreams, she wrote. And the tree I cut down grows there again, taller, brighter. Sometimes I sit under it, and there's peace. At the bottom, her last line read, I don't expect forgiveness. But I hope someday, the wall doesn't need to stand between us anymore. No signature. Just that. I set the letter down, unsure what to feel. Anger seemed pointless. Pity felt hollow. What I felt instead was something deeper, something quieter. The strange understanding that sometimes revenge doesn't end when the plan is complete. Sometimes it lingers, growing roots in both people until the only way to move on is to let go. I folded the letter back into its envelope and tucked it in the drawer where I kept small, forgotten things, old photos, receipts, notes. I didn't tell anyone. But that night, I dreamed too. I dreamed of the oak tree, whole again, its branches heavy with leaves. The sunlight poured through them, spilling across the yard like gold. The wall was still there, but it looked different. Softer. Covered in vines, almost hidden beneath green. And on the other side of it stood Karen, not angry, not bitter, just watching. When I woke, the sky outside was the same soft color as in the dream. The morning light caught the vines climbing the wall, painting them gold. It was then that I made my decision. That afternoon, I bought a young oak sapling from the local nursery. Small, thin, fragile but alive. I planted it near the base of the wall, just a few feet from where the old tree once stood. As I packed the soil around it, I thought of everything that had led to this, the arguments, the destruction, the revenge. All of it had begun with a tree. And now, it would end with one. The weeks passed, and the sapling began to grow. Its tiny leaves reached toward the sunlight that filtered between the wall and the horizon. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was a start. The Grant's little boy watched me often from his side of the yard. One day, I saw him plant a small flower beside the wall, mimicking what I'd done. Then his mother added a few more, until soon there was a line of color stretching along both sides. Tiny bursts of red, yellow, and blue climbing toward the stone. The wall, once a monument to bitterness, slowly became something else. A shared space. A memory that didn't divide anymore, but connected. Months later, another envelope arrived. This one came from a lawyer's office out of town. Inside was a notice, a small estate document. It said Karen had passed away quietly 3 months earlier. Among her belongings, she had left a short note addressed to the man who built the wall. It was simple, almost childlike. It said, "If you ever see something bloom near that wall, know that I see it too." No more, no less. That was the day I stopped calling it the wall. Now, when people asked, I just called it the line of light. Because that's what it had become, the place where darkness ended, and something new began. And sometimes at sunset, when the sky turned to amber and the light stretched long across the ground, I'd look at the young oak tree and think of her, not as an enemy, but as part of a story that had finally found its end. Because revenge might feel satisfying, but forgiveness, quiet, unspoken, unforced, is the only thing that truly lasts. The shadow still falls every evening. But now, instead of covering the yard, it lands on green leaves, bright petals, and new life. And if you stand there long enough, you can almost hear the faint rustle of wind through the wall's vines, soft, like the whisper of peace between two people who finally learned to let go.